Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and I'm here to share my thoughts thus far on Creature Commandos. We are at roughly the halfway point as of this posting, so that is episodes 1 through 4. And I figure now is as good a time as any to share my thoughts on if I think the series is doing well or not. And I figure it's familiar territory for me because I also have written certain books about monsters being recruited for a team to fight a greater evil, and a sequel to it. Now that the shameless self-promotion is out of the way, and you can also check out any of these other books if you want, let's get down to brass tacks about how I feel about Creature Commandos, which is, technically speaking, the beginning of James Gunn's DC universe. You know, by a technicality. Now, this is going to sound like a weird place to start, but one thing I can say about the show at this point is that it is a very consistent series. By that I mean there are a lot of shows out there that are serialized stories, you know, where all the episodes flow together to tell one continuous story, that suffer from too many cooks in the kitchen. You know what I mean. There's a whole pool of directors and a whole pool of writers, and each one gets to do a different episode all the way to the end. Maybe the people who developed the series get to write the first and last episodes to give some sort of continuity throughout, but otherwise it's like handing off a chapter of a novel to different people every time. It's gonna result in some inconsistency. I'm not against the idea of having a large pool of writers and directors for something that's more, say, episodic, or something like a variety show or what have you. But to tell a single continuous story, it results in a show that's usually uneven. You can either have a generally good show with at least one really bad episode, or a generally bad show with one really great episode, and anything in between. That's not the case with Creature Commandos. James Gunn wrote every single episode. He's the only credited writer. And as far as directors go, duties are traded off between Sam Liu and Matt Peters. And all three of them seem to be on the same page as far as their vision for the series. What that means is that, like I said, the series has been consistent throughout. It's not high peaks and low valleys. It's generally staying along a steady path. Now, whether that path is good or bad is something I'll be elaborating on in a moment, but I did want to say that right up front. Not having a whole host of people trying to pull all of this together, I think was a good idea. It is to the show's advantage overall. In terms of animation, I would say it's pretty good, but not spectacular. Art style has a very light anime influence, though is clearly still a Western cartoon, and the way it's animated, you know, it's fluid when it needs to be fluid, static when it needs to be static. There's no single shot that really jumps out as really spectacularly animated, but nothing that's, like, terribly animated either. Although I have occasionally noticed that there are a couple of shots that don't quite match with everything else, where the character movement just kind of looks a little bit off. I've racked my brain, and the closest thing I can compare it to is Archer. You know the art style of Archer, where the characters are drawn to have dimensionality, you know, shading, different angles and everything, but the way they move, they still look obviously flat? And I'm not saying that's a bad animation style. That is clearly the style that Archer adopted and just ran with for its entire run, but that was a deliberate choice there. Occasionally, shots in Creature Commandos look kind of like that, but that is not the style of the show. So when those shots happen, they do stand out. It's only every once in a while, so it's not like all of a sudden there's really bad animation or anything. It's just that every once in a while, the movement looks kind of like that. The characters suddenly look like they fall into that weird zone of looking like they should be 3D but moving like they're 2D, and I can't help but notice it. That's about the only thing I can say that really stands out as a glaring thing with the animation. Otherwise, like I said, it's pretty consistent throughout. So on the technical side, it's okay. And I suppose since I'm talking about the animation, it is only prudent to ask, did this need to be an animated show? I would say yes. Superhero media lends itself well to animation anyway, but I also think that choosing to go fully animated was a good idea because of how many non-human characters we're dealing with. And not even just characters. It's not like Guardians of the Galaxy where you have two characters that definitely need to be CGI or whatever other technique you might use, and the rest you can have normal humans in makeup, or whether it's just like paint or a few prosthetics or something. You're dealing with monsters here, things that are only kind of human in appearance. You have a flaming skeleton, you have a fish woman, you have this weird Tasmanian devil-looking critter. Those are things that can be done with modern special effects, but if there's all sorts of different things you have to work out, incorporating them into a live-action setting, so ultimately it's much easier to just do the whole thing in animation. And 2D animation in particular, I think, lends itself well to making the characters visually appealing. I just mean in a general sense. For example, take the character of Nina Mazursky. She's supposed to be like a female creature from the Black Lagoon type, and she's supposed to, I guess, look cute, but in a creature-y kind of way. But if you were to render her in live action, whether it was an actor in prosthetic, fully CGI, or a mixture of the two methods, that would require a lot of different details to be put in, which I feel might detract from the aesthetic nature of the character. Whereas with 2D animation, like what we see here, you don't need to draw every single scale, every single line on her fins and things like that. You can just have a relatively simplified design, put in enough details to suggest something more, and the human mind fills in the rest. And the result is a pleasing character design to look at. And of course, then you don't have to worry about bad special effects potentially popping in. A character like Dr. Phosphorus not only would be very expensive to do, but there's always a chance he wouldn't quite look right because he's supposed to be not quite on fire the way Ghost Rider is, but he is supposed to be like a flaming skeleton type. So you have the consistency when you're doing it all animated, all in the same style. So overall, yeah, I think going with animation was a good idea. So what about the storytelling and the character development? Well, like I said, we're only at the halfway point, roughly the halfway point, so the whole story hasn't been told just yet. But overall, you know, I'm interested to see where it's going at this point, but what about the finer details? This, of course, is not an animated show for kids. This is an example of adult animation. And there's always that risk that when something is for mature audiences, it may actually end up being for immature audiences. You know what I mean. When people know that they are not going to be making something for children, they think that gives them carte blanche to be as violent and as sexual and as crass as they can possibly be, resulting in something that really can't be enjoyed by adults, but you can't show it to children either, so it ultimately ends up being for nobody. Does Creature Commandos go that far? Well, it's definitely pushing it. Obviously, there's gonna be more language than Disney would have ever allowed James Gunn to put in a Marvel movie, but I don't think it necessarily goes too far. They do curse more than you would expect from a comic book movie. All the characters do. But I don't think it's quite to the point where it becomes white noise, where the characters are swearing so much that there's nothing else clever in their dialogue. At least not yet. I think it's kind of almost edging that way, but it is holding back just enough that they're not overdoing it. In terms of violence, yeah, it gets really violent, especially when GI Robot is shooting people. They have it be as over-the-top bloody and gruesome as possible. So, was that necessary? I don't necessarily know, because, I mean, even though we're dealing with monsters here, Creature Commandos isn't really a horror series. Not fully. And I don't think we're really meant to be frightened by it. It's disturbing to look at, sure, but I guess it didn't really need to go as gruesome as it does. Unless, of course, the series was supposed to be much darker and much more unsettling. Although I don't necessarily know if that was the case. And as far as sexual content goes, I think all of us were surprised by how horny this show was just in its first couple of episodes. Like, it doesn't get overly graphic, although it definitely goes pretty far in that regard. And like I said, it was very surprising. It is relevant a lot of the time. Like, the fact that Rick Flag Sr. and the Princess of Pulvakistan, or I don't remember exactly the country they went to, its name. It's a made-up place anyway, I'm pretty sure. If it's not, I apologize. But the fact that they wind up together, or at least they have their moment, that is clearly relating into something more. The thing that happens between the bride and Victor Frankenstein and the bride's backstory, that is like, you can tell it's building up to that, and I'll be elaborating more on it in a moment, but maybe they didn't need to go as far as they did, but it is ultimately still kind of the breaking point with that particular story. So it was kind of unavoidable, but again, did they need to go as far as they did? I'm not so sure it was completely necessary. Speaking of completely unnecessary, there was one element that got the attention of certain channels on YouTube right off the bat, which is how the Sons of Themyscira, with the army that Circe amasses, are portrayed. They are clearly meant to be caricatures of far-right, terminally online commentator, MAGA, Trump supporter types. I sometimes refer to them as Circe's simp army for short. But, you know, obviously that was gonna ruffle a lot of feathers because it was a politically charged thing. That's also one of the first things we see in the entire show. So, does it actually work? I'm not so sure. Yes, the politically charged stuff clearly was from a particular time, and I'm sure everybody involved thought it was going to age much better than it wound up doing pre-2024 presidential election. But you know what? Even if we set aside the political stuff for a moment, I still don't think the Sons of Themyscira really work as our opening villains. If you remove the political stuff, they don't make sense. We're clearly meant to see them as kind of joke characters. None of them look particularly threatening. They have funny sounding voices. When they talk, they sound like idiots, and they ramble on about a bunch of weird stuff. They don't behave very well. And they're clearly not threatening. It doesn't look even remotely like they should be much of a threat. And yet, we're supposed to believe that they can somehow overthrow a country with an army that utilizes Magitech armor that, according to Circe, is going to destroy the entire world. You can't reconcile those two. Either they aren't a threat or they are. They can't be both. So just on that level, they don't work as opening villains. And if you add the political element back in, you're directly attacking people, which I have said many, many times is not a smart idea when you're in the entertainment business. Although they seem to have been dealt with as of episode 3, and now that we've gotten the big twist that Cersei claims to have been acting altruistically, I highly doubt they're going to get mentioned again. So they were ultimately just throwaway villains that we weren't supposed to take seriously, and yet we're also supposed to take deadly seriously. Not the best move for the series, but like I said, they're gone now. But what about our main characters, the actual proper creature commandos? We, of course, are learning their backstories throughout this series, and at this point, like I said, roughly halfway through, 4 episodes in, we've only gotten the backstories for the bride, with hints of Eric Frankenstein's backstory, and we'll see if that gets expanded on later. We've also got the backstory for G.I. Robot, and we've got the backstory for the Weasel. The bride's backstory, first of all, very familiar. Not because it's based on Mary Shelley's original novel, and not because it's based on James Whale's sequel to the 1931 movie, but rather because it's based on the 1980s movie, The Bride, which is most notable because that's the one where Sting, the lead singer and bassist from The Police, plays the Doctor. I kind of feel that had to be deliberate, an intentional homage. And it is only an homage, it's not just lifting the plot wholesale, but that seems to be the main inspiration. Victor Frankenstein is supposed to make a bride for his monster, instead he winds up forming a connection with it. It's different, however, in that, unlike in The Bride the movie, Creature Commandos, Victor and the bride are forming a mutual bond with each other. And they're doing this because Eric Frankenstein, and Eric is the name of the monster in this case, he is unfortunately not mentally well. He is the Frankenstein monster after all. In this case, this seems to manifest as him being overly emotional, kind of immature in some ways, and that leads to him not being very romantic, coming on too strong, terrifying the bride, not just with his appearance, but with how forceful he's trying to be. Not like he's trying to force himself onto her, but he's like, she was literally made for me, why doesn't she love me back? But the bride's forming more of a relationship with Victor, who's teaching her and taking care of her. And yes, that does ultimately result in them consummating their relationship, which the monster walks in on. And it's one of those scenarios where you can understand why the bride is repulsed by Eric, but at the same time, Victor totally betrayed his creation. Not to mention, he cheated on his wife, because it's established that he's married. And there's also kind of an unfortunate undercurrent in how the bride, despite having the body of an adult woman, is mentally still pretty immature herself during that segment. So ultimately, Victor kind of brought it on himself, what Eric winds up doing to him. Of course, that's just the bride's part of the story. I have a feeling we're gonna see Eric's side of the story at some point, and how that's going to flesh him out remains to be seen. Now, as for G.I. Robot, I gotta admit I was not as impressed with his backstory. It feels like there's some stuff that might be missing. A lot of it does make sense. You know, we first see him with Sergeant Rock and Easy Company in the midst of World War II, and G.I. is in his element. He's there to win the war and kill him some Nazis. And it works. It's a nice little throwback to those older war comics, or the weird war comics even. But of course, after the war is won, he becomes kind of directionless, and that's understandable. He's now looking for Nazis to kill because that's what he was built to do, but there are no more left. He apparently helps Dr. Magnus in his pursuit of making the Metal Men, but what else is left to do for him? Then we get to the part where we learn why he's in custody. And this is a part where I felt G.I.'s backstory didn't quite click, and I can explain why. Not to mention I can explain how I think I could have been done better. So, the twist winds up being that eventually G.I. just winds up forgotten, and he's bought by a military collector named Sam. He wanted to join the army, he has some unspecified issue with his leg that prevented him from joining, so he's a collector instead. And it seems like it's a good scenario. You know, Sam's kind of an oddball, sure, but he likes GI, he's going to take good care of him, GI's got a home. Maybe the robot can just live a peaceful existence now. Then Sam says he's going to bring GI to a meeting with some buddies who want to make the nation a better place. And it turns out to be a neo-Nazi rally. GI's programming kicks in immediately and he kills everybody there. He is apparently determined to be human, human enough at least that he can stand trial. I would love to see that expanded on at some point. And when he's found guilty, he's thrown in jail. Now, why don't I think this works? I mean, in a way, it makes sense that this would be the thing that landed him in jail, but it's the way it plays out. On the one hand, the twist that Sam is bringing GI to a neo-Nazi rally is pretty obvious. As soon as he said, I'm going to bring you to this particular meeting, you're coming along with me, I just knew they're going someplace that's going to set him off. And the more he said, the more obvious it became, until finally we see the swastika unveiled behind the speaker, and you know it. So it was kind of obvious, but at the same time, it comes right the heck out of nowhere, because there was no indication that Sam would be a neo-Nazi. Unless the clue was supposed to be that he's a military collector, but that's an awfully weird clue. I would actually think if he was that interested in history, he'd be less likely to be a Nazi. Because, you know, Nazis tend to be very anti-history. You'd be amazed the kind of things that in the 30s and 40s the Nazi Party was actually claiming the real history of the world was and the real way the universe works and everything. It is fascinating stuff. Completely bonkers, mind you. But it's so fascinating to see. I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. I'm trying to stay focused on Creature Commandos. So I just don't think it really made sense for that twist to be the case. So how could it have been fixed? I came up with an alternate scenario as I was thinking about it. And for all I know, maybe something like this was initially the case and it was cut for time. I just know this is what I would have done. So it requires Sam to have a little bit more of a backstory. In this scenario, similar setup, right? He wanted to join the army, but he's got a bum leg, he can't join, so he becomes a collector instead. At a certain point, somebody he knows invites him to a meeting. He realizes it's a bunch of neo-Nazis in Hub City. And he doesn't like this idea. At first he's really shocked, but then he thinks about it and realizes, hang on, maybe I've got an opportunity to actually be a hero here. If I pretend that I'm all for this and that I'm gonna join, I can find some way to erode them from within, or I can gather some evidence and bring it to the authorities or something. Either way, maybe he's in a good position to do some good in the world, which he would have done had he joined the army, but couldn't. However, the longer he's with this group and the more evidence he's collecting, the more he realizes he's kind of stuck, because first of all, he's not sure how he can actually get people to turn on each other in this group. They all seem pretty tightly knit, and he's the newcomer. But moreover, he's gathered all this evidence, but what's he going to do with it? He's learned that there are some people who are part of this neo-Nazi party who hold some pretty significant positions in Hub City. They're in the media, they're on the police force, they're in the mayor's office. All different places where they could potentially stonewall any evidence he submits. And even if he submits it anonymously, somebody could still potentially find out it was him, and then he's really in trouble. So now what is he going to do? He's stuck going to these rallies he doesn't believe in, gathering a bunch of evidence he can't use. Then he acquires GI Robot, and he thinks, aha, now I have an ally. It's simple. This robot was designed to kill Nazis, and I'm starting to think this is the only way we can deal with them. All I have to do is bring him to a rally, he'll do his job, maybe then we'll have to beat feet and head somewhere else, but hey, the problem will be dealt with. However, he unfortunately overestimates GI's capabilities for nuance, doesn't necessarily explain the plan properly, and once they're there, GI's programming kicks in, all he sees around him are Nazis, and he guns them all down, starting with the man who brought him there in hopes that he would do exactly that. When GI is caught, it is determined that he has the right to a trial because even though he's mechanical and could fit the definition of a weapon because he was constructed and designed to be used in combat, he still acted autonomously, which no other weapon in the world has done. So he deserves at least his shot in court. Initially, he pleads not guilty because he killed Nazis, and how is that a bad thing? And as the trial continues, all these secrets are coming to light about who was part of this thing, and it becomes clear that maybe they actually were planning something like an act of domestic terrorism that would have devastated Hub City had they pulled it off. So now the question becomes, were GI's actions actually good in the long term, and could he potentially get off because of that? Will the jury sympathize with him because he prevented a catastrophe? But then the prosecution brings in the evidence that Sam had collected as evidence against GI, showing that Sam was not part of the party, but he was still one of the victims. This causes something to go off in GI's robotic brain. He realizes he killed an innocent man. Not just an innocent man, a comrade, a brother in arms. Maybe an unconventional one, but he may as well have shot Sergeant Rock in the back for all that it matters. On the spot, realizing this, he changes his plea to guilty. And so he is sentenced, and it carries out the same way. And that would be the reason why, in the present, he always asks if somebody is a Nazi before he shoots them. Because the one time he shot first without asking questions, it led to the greatest mistake of his mechanical life. Like I said, that's how I would have done it. That's not what's actually in the episode. But I must admit, I wasn't initially impressed with that. But of course, as of episode 4, we've got Weasel's backstory. And again, there's a certain level of predictability here, because I suspected that all these claims of Weasel being a child killer weren't all they were cracked up to be. But sometimes predictability doesn't necessarily equate to bad storytelling. It's how you tell it that matters. And I do think this was told especially well. We don't know what Weasel is in this particular universe. He only bears like a mild resemblance to the character who's actually in the comics. And I had to dig really deep to find any information about that character. So we are talking super obscure here. But he doesn't really resemble that character, like I said. So we don't know if he's some sort of genetic mutation, or a cryptid, or a werewolf, or anything. We don't know. We just know he's this weird, slightly anthropomorphic critter. But when we do learn what happened, and we learn that he was actually trying to save children, but circumstances just kept framing him in a light where people saw him as a monster, and because he can't talk, he couldn't really disprove them. I mean, it actually did work. It really did. And a large part of that goes to how he's animated, of course, because there are so many little things they do. Just the way his body moves. He has a very unusual form, mildly humanoid, but all these different parts to him that just don't match up with human anatomy. But it's like the way his tail is moving, those moments when his eyes focus instead of just staring off in different directions. Things like that. The way his creepy toothed grin will subtly change. That does a lot towards allowing us to figure out what he's actually thinking. And then bringing it all together is Sean Gunn's voice acting. I know that there are people out there who think Sean Gunn only has a career because of nepotism. He is James Gunn's brother, after all. But darn it all, the man can act. And this proves he can voice act. He voices both Weasel and GI Robot. And if you were to put their two audio tracks side by side, you might not guess that they were voiced by the same guy, and that same guy was Kraglin. So the man has acting chops, and Weasel's a particularly difficult role because he can't speak. He only makes vocalizations, wordless grunts and growls and shrieks and whatnot. So how do you make a sympathetic character with that sort of limitation? He did it. That scream Weasel makes when the little girl he's trying to save perishes, that ripped my heart out. I'm not gonna lie. It really did get me. I feel so bad for him, and apparently it got a lot of other people too, because I actually looked on Big Bad Toy Store both before the episode aired and afterward. Before the episode aired, there were a lot of Creature Commandos things on pre-order, including all the Funko Pops and that super expensive statue of Weasel. They were all still available. After the episode I hopped on there, the Weasel Funko Pop and the Weasel statue were both sold out. So clearly this spoke to people enough that they actually want that character represented in their collections. But even setting aside that part of it, I think they really made that backstory work. And to put a cherry on top of it, it's what we learn after that, where we see that he's remembering all of this in a nightmare as the Osprey is carrying them back to that country. And he's asleep making those noises. You can tell he's upset. And Nina says, I wonder what he's dreaming about. The bride says, probably just chasing squirrels, which is, of course, the title of the episode. And that just hammers home the tragedy of the character, because we know he's smarter than an animal, though not necessarily that smart, not human level per se. And we also know he's innocent of the crime he was accused of, but who's ever going to know? He can't communicate. The world just sees him as an animal. Even other monsters don't think that highly of him. That's what really drives it home. Okay, so what are my overall thoughts? I would say that Creature Commandos is flawed, but I like the stuff that works more than I dislike the stuff that doesn't work. In the end, it's pretty good at this point. Not spectacular, but I'm enjoying it enough, and I'm curious to see where it goes in its second half. Here's hoping it can really deliver. I know James Gunn has delivered with other characters before, so fingers crossed. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer, realizing I have said the word Nazi so many times that YouTube is probably going to bury this video, so please help promote it, because otherwise I'm sunk.